Hello, everyone. My name is Colt Brock. I am your 2023-2024 AIAS National President. I use he, him pronouns, and today we are doing Ask an Architect with none other than Kelsey Jordan. Kelsey, good afternoon.
Hey, good afternoon. How's it going?
Good. The weather is a little warm in DC, but it's been great. So, how about you?
Good. It rained a little bit today, but it's now beautiful, so it's going to be a great day.
Awesome. So, just wanted to ask, could you tell us about your educational background, where you're currently located, and what inspired you to pursue a career in architecture?
Sure. So my educational background is not a typical path by any means. So I started my first 2 years at a community college in Illinois, in Peoria, Illinois, because I had lived there and I was working for Caterpillar at the time in logistics. So I started there and then I transferred to Southern Illinois University in Carbondale. And then from that, I stayed for my master's there. So SIU has a 15-month master's program, and I stayed down there while my future husband was in St. Louis. And then we moved from St. Louis, and now we are back up in the Chicago area. So we've bounced around a little bit. And so that was my educational experience.
And then, yeah, so what inspired you to get into architecture, though? What made you jump from that into that master's, and what kept you in and what kept you going?
So what really inspired me was growing up. So I am an architect that designs schools. I'm an architect, an educational planner, educational designer. And it was always with growing up and seeing places where it didn't seem fair. So for instance, there's a school district that is right up against our district from by where I grew up, and it was deemed as not as good of an area. And I always questioned why on that. And then the older that I got, I understood how certain kids would get disadvantaged just solely because they lived where they lived. And that also didn't seem fair, that there's something completely outside of their control and they're getting knocked for it for their whole life. So I then started taking architectural classes and engineering classes in high school and went and looked things up. And I really love math. I like math a whole lot, but I really like art a whole lot too. And so I looked up, how can I intersect those two? And architecture popped up. So I went, and it's also part of why I did community college first, was seeing if this is what I really wanted to do, and it just stuck since then. So yes, so for me, that way to keep moving everything forward throughout school was that understanding of how the built environment can be used as a way to positively impact people's lives. And I also learned early on at the community college that we are all our choices. There are certain choices that have been made for us because of architecture. So if you think of your house, for instance, that you grew up in, so that house probably didn't have a corridor that had windows in it. So you probably weren't like waking up in the morning and immediately going into your hallway and seeing these windows. It was probably all the bedrooms were in one location. And maybe because of how your house was set up, you had to carry groceries, up some stairs and around and down, before you got to the kitchen. And that was all because somebody somewhere made that choice for you on how you would interact with it. So that was also really powerful for me when thinking of how to lay things out.
No,
And
that's
how
really
to.
great.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so I guess kind of building on that, you've talked about how your experience and then how your education has impacted kind of your approach. Now we'll kind of flip that. And what do you think the most important qualities an architect should have? What are those qualities?
Listening and empathy.
Short and sweet. I love it.
Easy, yeah,
I
but
love
just
it.
that.
I love that. So I think, you talk about doing education work. So do you predominantly work in higher ed, K-12? Do you do non-traditional education buildings or spaces? Do you want to elaborate on that some?
Sure. So I've done all of K-12 through higher ed, have worked on all of it. I predominantly do K-12. However, I really do like higher education as well. And I believe that we can cross-pollinate the two and learn from it. That, higher ed spaces don't always have to be stuffy. They can have the fun that the little kids can have, but the little kids could also have some more serious type spaces that you would see typically in higher ed for those collaboration spaces. So yes, I've done all of them, and then I can't remember the rest of your question. I'm so sorry.
No, I was just going to have you elaborate on the kind of breadth of work that you do, like which area, and maybe you could even throw in which one you prefer working on, which one's your favorite, which type.
Yeah, so elaborating on it more would be I enjoy looking at different educational environments when thinking of the educational pedagogy that can be put into it. So, what that means is how is the curriculum delivered? And what psychological aspects are in this educational environment? So, as I see it, there's different ways that you can approach that educational environment or any type of architecture really. You can add very in your face approaches to it, an active approach, or you can have these passive approaches to it. So with a passive approach, you might be putting windows at a certain height just so kids can look outside, because we know that these biophilic elements help kids learn more and retain and do better, but also feel better. And how is that feeling impact how their outlook with everything else is? Another thing that I would encourage, which it goes into empathy and listening, is that when you think of an environment, and again, this can be applied across the board. When you think of an environment, not only asking the user that it's working for, but asking a user that it's not working for. So for instance, we know that that kid who is that A+ kid, they are loving what they're doing. And there can be arguments made that regardless of where they're at, there could be a high achieving student. But what about your student who's not high achieving? They're going to tell you what's not working for them and what they need to make something better. And a lot of times that could be something as simple as they need a quieter space. They need a place for them to express who they are. They need whatever it is. Or it could be a passive thing more that they need better help at home. They need health. They need wellness. Something like that that can be tied back to the built environment. So that's really exciting. The pedagogy approaches that I think are really interesting. If you've never heard of it, the 9 types of intelligence, and looking that up, and it basically describes how different people thrive in different situations. So I don't know about you, and chime in, but I cannot have music going in focus. There is nothing about that works for me, but I can have background noise with TV all day long.
I'm the opposite.
Yeah.
So I gotta have the music. The
Goodness
music has to
too.
go, but no
Yeah.
background noise. No background noise for me. So
Well, and that's one of the types of intelligence is musical. In that they need musical elements to do best. Another type is a naturalistic, so they need these aspects of nature. And then it goes into different types as well, where you have your people person, you have your body's kinesthetic kid, so your kid that's always moving up and down, everything, typically who's your really good athlete, but not always. So how to accommodate these different intelligent types and personality types, if you look at it that way,
Mhm.
in a classroom so that it's also their learning type is
Mhm.
the best possible there. And so that's really cool to get to weave those all together to make everybody have that space where they feel safe, secure, both physically and mentally.
Definitely. Yeah, no, that's the nine intelligence types. I'm gonna have to look that one up after. I know I've heard it and read it, but I really want to look back into it. I think kind of building on that, you've touched on a bit, I think it would be safe to say, and correct me if I'm wrong, that education spaces are just as much community spaces as they are education spaces. How do
Yeah.
you go about, or how do people on your team, or people in your space, like working in the same space, how do you go about engaging the community being students, educators, parents? Like, how do y'all go about making sure that their voices are heard in the design process?
Sure. So there's different approaches that you can do for it. And I believe that there's different successful approaches depending on what the culture of the community is. So, for instance, there are places who are very closed off. They do not want an architect there. They think you're coming in to change what they're doing. And that does not mean that we come off as like, well, we know the best for you, because you never should come off that way. You should always come in as listening and understanding what their unique culture is to approach that, as a way to at least start thinking about things. But with engaging with the community, there are a couple different ways, again, that we can do it. It could be something as simple as a Survey Monkey survey, asking them what they want. But that can feel a little impersonal. But flip side, that works in people's schedules sometimes a little bit better. Um, Another way to actively engage students would be going into the spaces that are getting changed. So, for instance, I've done it before with a library renovation where we had a group of fifth graders and we got them in the room that was going to get renovated. So, their library getting renovated. And we said, okay, everybody stand up. And we're going to have you guys in an orderly fashion. Don't run, don't get in trouble, not on my part. We're going to have you guys go to the places in the library that are your favorite place. And they went. And then they described to us why they liked it, and using the verbiage, and you could tell what they needed. Then you said, okay, we're going to do the same thing. Go to the places you hate and tell us why you don't like that space. And they were way more open there as well of
Mhm.
not liking something. So that's one way that's fun and interactive for the kids, because then they can physically get involved with that. With a community and on a whole, I would encourage a grouping of community engagement sessions, always recapping what happened in the last one so that it catches people up to speed. And so that engagement could be something where they're getting a whole new facility, maybe. And it could be coming in with a kit of parts, like
Mhm.
what roughly the size of certain spaces are, and letting people play with it on a plan and move things around. And it'll show you how they're wanting something to function or
Mhm.
what they're thinking would work best. And a lot of times we have some kind of an idea of what we think, but they're showing us something that we never would have thought of at the
Mhm.
same time, because we don't live it every day.
Mhm.
So it's super, super valuable in that aspect as well, to get their feedback, because they're the end users, but
Mhm.
always listening to them the whole time of their needs, especially the ones that are in the background. So another thing with community engagement is that when you're in big groups, your introverts are not comfortable to speak up. So a lot of times it is your loudest person who is talking. So if you think just to a normal typical classroom, like sitting there in studio, your loud extrovert, they're the one whose opinion goes through.
Mhm.
But your introvert are typically your people who think about things internally a lot. So when they do speak, it's the most profound thing. So, so the way to get them involved as well is to have those hands-on exercises where they, in smaller groups, where they have to participate, or doing something that is where they can write or draw. Because a great example of it is, if I ask you right now, how are you doing? What would your response be? Probably good,
Yeah.
fine.
Yeah. Very surface level.
Yep. And that's because that's such a learned response that we have. So the idea of criticizing things could be difficult for people, especially if there's someone who's already not going to speak out. So doing something that engages, slows down the speech and engages physically, with writing or drawing or moving little pieces, really is so valuable.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Building on that and kind of calling back to some things you mentioned earlier, you talked about, both areas in which you grew up, areas in which you went to school. You've kind of always touched on and kind of acknowledged and absorbed this idea of this tiered system of kind of benefit to lots of different things, right? And access to things. And so specifically within education spaces, you probably have one of the more diverse groups of people than you would in other places, like in an office building or in this. You have a very wide breadth of people. How can education design specifically within a community help kind of break down socioeconomic and cultural disparities between people? Like how is an education space, like how is the built environment able to play into that in your experience, or help to break down some of those barriers?
Sure. So, you have these ideas called wicked problems. So they're the things that can't be solved with one solution, because they're so intertwined with each other. And so those disparities, like you're talking about, the poverty, obesity, food deserts, access, whatever they might be, are all interconnected into how a student can learn. So, for instance, if you have a little guy who's coming in and he hasn't had breakfast and he doesn't have a pen or a pencil and he doesn't have paper, then he's not ready to learn. He's hungry, he's embarrassed, or could be embarrassed because he doesn't have the stuff to do what everybody else needs. So they're all so interconnected. So in the built environment, with education, one way that we can do that is really understanding with that community aspect, what that community's biggest issue could be, and trying to see how the educational environment could better achieve that. So we just got selected to do an educational equity assessment, which is looking at different buildings inside of the school district. So it's a really big district. It's 26 schools. And so they have different communities and different needs throughout that. So it's understanding there how that specific community for that school can get what it needs, but also be a part of the whole. Also be a part of that. Specific examples of things that I can think of would be, I know of a district that had quite a bit of homelessness, for example. And their students, because of that, they're with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, they didn't have shelter. So their focus is not on school, it's on, where am I going to sleep tonight? What am I going to eat tonight? Type of a thing. So this district helped that aspect out with a food pantry and a clothing pantry and everything for their students intertwined into it, and destigmatized it as well. So that way, no student was getting, called out for needing additional help. So that's a good way. When you look at different things more passively on what the built environment can do to help with that, I think transparency is a big aspect. and making sure that the space is safe, but also that we are providing quality spaces in lower income areas and not just our higher income areas, because that's not fair. That's saying that you don't deserve to have as good of a space, and that's wrong.
Yeah, and so I guess what, you talk about these things that for many, I mean, even back when I was in school, or when any of us were in school, those things would not have been traditional or what we would have expected, right? Or even going through undergrad or going through school, you might say, oh, I can see these things are needs, but I've never experienced that in my education space. So what agency do you see as a designer and as an architect, um, working with that client to identify those needs? Because there might be things that you say, we need this, or they might say, oh, we need this, but these aren't spaces that we consider traditional or that would fit into like a normal hierarchy of education, like an educational building. Like, what agency do you see a designer have advocating for things that are missing, or saying, these ideas are great, here's how we can achieve your vision?
Sure. So, stepping back and going back into community engagement real quick. One way with doing that with the surveys, it's super great when we have the architects who are the ones evaluating the surveys. So what that's doing is purposely putting a middle party in there so that honest feedback will come back. And then we also put a little note on it that says that your specific thing that you say is not going, it cannot be tied back to you, which it can't. I have no way of knowing who it's coming from. I guess IP addresses. I'm not that smart to tie it back, but yeah, we have that language that it can't get tied back to you. Please tell us something honest there. And so with evaluation of those surveys and what we've listened to and heard with that community engagement, or just speaking with different people, we then have identified these needs, that you're talking about. So it's very hard to walk away from a large need that you heard of. And most of the time, districts are immediately on board, or they already know the need. They're immediately on board to fix that if they're a good district that's trying to work towards helping their community, being involved with their community, and helping their kids. So that's normally really on our side, that the kids in the community are so actively involved in the district, because that's where their kids are most of the time. But it's not always the case. So for instance, if it's an older community, then they might not be engaged. They will not pass to vote a referendum because it doesn't affect them. So trying to find that need there does help give agency, and then finding the research to back it up, to back up why this space would need what it does. That research really helps to tell the story, because you want to tell the story. You don't just want to come across again as someone who, I know this, so it has to be that way. Well, it's not your space. You might be designing it, but it's not yours. It's theirs. So how they can get what they need to achieve what they need to achieve, that's your agency, is the research and your backup from the community.
That's great. Wow. Yeah, I mean, I think pretty clear that education spaces, specifically K-12, are probably the areas in which we design spaces that are most dissimilar to our own experience, because we're adults. Typically, we're out of school. We don't understand, being a child anymore. We might think that we do, or we might want to, but we don't. And I think bringing that in, how do you, there are unique needs in every district, and then within every district, probably even within every school. When you're facing public projects like that, how do you go about, being specific enough for that space when you're really not designing with your own experience in mind? We all kind of design from a framework of our own experiences. So what is kind of the process that you go through in being specific enough for that space, or for that group?
So yeah, so I think there's two things there, and one is listening as well to the kids' ideas. So that same library project where I had the kids just scatter, I added on, and some of it's for my own amusement because I really enjoy seeing little kids sketches. But the last page, I always add on of draw me what you would like to see in your library. And this little guy came up with a book vending machine. I'm like, man, that's awesome. And
That's
then they
really cool.
all were ready to franchise Starbucks because they really wanted this cafe in their space, which third graders do not need coffee. So they did not get that. But coming up with their ideas and being able to, so okay, fine, they're not going to get coffee, but we can do something that's more of a bar-like area where they can sit up there and sit tall, sit strong, kind of be proud about it. Another thing is empathy, is huge. So we are just now in-house finishing a school that is for all special needs students. It ranges from autistic to behavioral, and it's this great project that's going on. And so much research was put in behind it, so that the space is what it needs to be for the students. And so we know certain things about the environment. Again, we know it, but I don't have autism. I don't know what it is like to step in the shoes of that. But also then talking with other kids who are and understanding what they might need and then finding the research behind it. So for instance, we know that certain kids who have autism, they really like to hug the walls. They really like that feeling of security all the way. So instead of having a typical hallway corridor where it points at, so you have the corridor running down and it goes into a classroom, just curving it, just a simple curve where they can easily turn into their classroom and have that sense of security there, and having different levels of quiet spaces for them so that things could calm down when they need to have that calming time, and trying to understand throughout the whole process what the student needs so that they can be the most successful. And we have talked about this as well in different places. And one way I encourage people to help with empathy is through games. So, for instance, what would happen if you played bags or cornhole or whatever you want to call it, and you couldn't see? So it's going to be really hard to play, but now you have to use sound or you have to rely on somebody else to do that. So that puts you in a space of, okay, how is this simple action that we all might be playing? How is that going to be for someone who is not, can't see, is visually impaired? How do you play, a seek and find real quick when you're timed as well, and you have like the drunk goggles on or really thick glasses or something, and how difficult that is and how that could relate back to something. Or my most favorite is playing Jenga with oven mitts on. It's impossible. It's so bad. It's so impossible, but it shows you too where it can teach scale. So we have the oven mitts, and we know with typical Jenga, it's so hard, can't get it. But if we use giant Jenga, now everybody can play, oven mitts and all. So that teaches how something can get used and scaled in a different way for everybody.
I think that's really great. Yeah, I don't think I want to try open mid Jenga anytime soon, but those sound like awesome exercises for bringing empathy into the design process. I think we'll start to wind down. So I'm going to close with some questions. The first one being, what advice would you give to young architects or, recent graduates and emerging professionals?
So I think young architects, when you're in school too, fail fast, fail early. Here's why. Because then when you have those ideas out, then you're going to see what works, what doesn't work, and you're going to find that path to something more that succeeds. For everybody, find what you're most passionate about. Please just find what makes you excited, because if you're not excited about it, then it shows when you're not. So those two are the most huge, I believe.
I wish I had learned those earlier than I did.
I know how many studio projects got put off or procrastinated, and then you're like, oh man, I could have done XYZ, or yeah.
The next one is, how can our listeners follow you and the projects that you work on?
Sure. So I am on LinkedIn under Kelsey Jordan. And then I am a part of Leggett Architects, Legat. And we also have social media, both on Instagram and LinkedIn, Facebook. So we're everywhere.
Perfect. And then the last one, which is I think going to be my favorite question. I'm excited to hear your answer. What is your hottest take on architecture?
Hottest take on architecture. I believe architecture is for everybody, and that it influences everybody. So it goes back to that whole idea of the house and how everything and how your environment has been chosen for you. So remember then, as an architect, how much agency you have over a space and how much your small choices can create huge impact for so many people. And it could be the most small project to the most big project. How you are laying it out, what your details are, everything. It so impacts it. So that would be my big take on architecture. Is it's for everybody. It involves everybody.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. It was a fantastic conversation. Thank you for sharing all of your insight and your wisdom. I've worked in education design in the past, and I absolutely love it. It's complicated and difficult, but it's always so fulfilling in the end. So thank you so much. Thank you for taking part in this awesome, funky thing we have going on, and we look forward to seeing this episode go live. So thank you so much, and we'll chat soon.
Sounds good. Appreciate it.
Bye.
Bye.